All right. Thank you, Achin, for the introduction. It's a joy to be with you all this evening as we come together during the time of the Great Lent, a time where we spend more time focusing on growing closer to our Lord, growing closer to our neighbor, and growing closer to ourselves as well, focusing on these three relationships during the Great and Holy Lent. So it's truly a joy to be with you all this evening. A joy to be with you, Achin, as well. Achin and I actually studied in seminary during the same time. We didn't study at the same seminary, but we studied in seminary during the same time. I was at St. Tigon's while he was at St. Vladimir's. So it's truly a joy to be here as Achin leads this truly important and meaningful ministry for your diocese. So today we come together to explore the topic of battling temptation, beginning with our intrusive thoughts. It's a big topic. I could spend hours and hours talking about this topic. We could have a discussion about it. There's a lot to talk about when it comes to this topic. But we're gonna keep it short today. It's gonna be an introduction to this topic, just looking at a few important things when it comes to temptation and intrusive thoughts. So we will begin um, by exploring this topic. So, Barak more glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, now and ever, and unto the ages of ages. Amen. So it's battling temptation, beginning with our intrusive thoughts. Just reflecting on our lives, how many of you guys, when you guys are driving, maybe perhaps on a bridge, I don't know where you are, all of you are in the Southwest, but perhaps you've driven on a bridge, right? And as you're driving, how many of you have had the thought, oh, what would it be like if I just, turned the wheel to the right and I just drove right off the bridge into the water? I'm sure those who are joining this call today is probably laughing or smiling by hearing that because I'm sure a lot of us, including myself, has had that intrusive thought that, oh, what would it be like if I just turned my wheel, and the car just went off the edge? Um, that thought perhaps have come to our mind. Perhaps whether you're a mother, whether you're a parent, whether you're a sibling, perhaps maybe it's thoughts about, maybe I'm not good enough, or I'm doing a really bad job as a mother. I'm not a good mother. Perhaps it's thoughts like that come to our mind, perhaps when things are challenging, when we're facing different struggles, when raising our kids, whatever it may be. Those thoughts perhaps have come to our mind. It could be as a student, maybe you're in college, maybe you're in high school, and you're studying and you're stressed out and there's a lot going on. Um, Perhaps it's thoughts that, oh my gosh, how am I going to do this? Or it's thoughts that maybe there's no hope, maybe that I'm not good enough to do this, right? To undertake this degree or whatever it may be, or maybe I might not make it. I might not pass. Maybe I'll get kicked out of the program. Thoughts that come to our mind, right? Thoughts that make us feel a certain way, right? Often this happens in our life. Thoughts that make us feel sad, thoughts that make us feel angry, thoughts that make us feel lonely, perhaps. It could be thoughts in our relationships. It could be between spouses. It could be between us and our loved ones. Maybe thoughts about, oh, does this person really love me? Or maybe thoughts that we question, maybe certain things about that person. Um, Random thoughts that come to our mind, right? Intrusive thoughts that try to separate us from our neighbor. Neighbor meaning it could be your spouse, it could be your friend, your sibling, whoever it may be. Thoughts that try to separate us from offering love to those around us. Thoughts perhaps that maybe a certain lifestyle will solve the issues, right, that we're facing, or maybe something out there will help us feel better, right? Different thoughts come to our mind throughout our day, from the moment we wake up to the moment we go to bed, and even in our sleep, I would say there are random thoughts that come to our mind, and sometimes they're intrusive thoughts, and intrusive thoughts meaning thoughts that separate us from ourself being able to love our neighbor and being able to love God in our life. We also encounter thoughts about Christ, about God. Sometimes thoughts of doubt, thoughts, does God exist? Is God really hearing my prayers? Is Christ really hearing my prayers? thoughts that question our faith, that cause us to maybe, it's a thought that you're wasting your time, thoughts like that, or maybe this is a waste of time, maybe I shouldn't do this, thoughts like that, that try to separate us from even Christ in our life. So Christ, our neighbor, and ourself, thoughts that try to separate us from these three relationships in our life. Um, and these thoughts continue to reign in our mind. It could be, the list goes on and what kind of thoughts that could be. This is a quote by Elder Thaddeus. He writes an awesome book that I'll recommend later at the end of the talk. This is what he says. He says, our thoughts determine our life. And if you reflect on that, it's often very true, right? It's whatever thoughts we have in our life, it determines the direction of our life, how we feel in our life, the relationships we have in our life, so on and so forth. The thoughts continue to impact our life, and how we look at life, how we look at ourselves, and the different things happening in our life. It all starts with our thoughts, right? Even look at the things that are on the news, right? It could be the crime we see on the news. It all started with a thought which caused whatever to happen, right? And even the good things that we see in our life, right? The good things that we see in our world, um, it all started with a thought that led to that. So we see the power of our thoughts. It has such a great impact on our lives. And we see this being written by Elder Thaddeus. And yes, like I mentioned, thoughts cause us to have a sea of emotion. This is the emotion wheel if you're not familiar with it. And I recommend you just go to Google, type in emotion wheel, and this is available for us to kind of identify what these thoughts are doing to us. But yeah, thoughts, they cause a lot of emotions too, right? If we think that we're not good enough, we might feel sad, we might feel lonely. If we feel that we're not a good mother or good father, or we're really failing at that, it might cause us to feel despair, to feel disappointed in ourselves, right? So thoughts lead to emotions. We see that, right? So, but often it begins with a thought, which leads to a certain emotion. And then sometimes it's an emotion that leads to a certain thought, right? We could feel lonely, and then a thought may come up that maybe you should do this or that to solve your loneliness. So sometimes it begins with thoughts, sometimes it begins with your emotions, but these two are connected to each other. But my point here is that thoughts cause certain emotions in our life, as we know from our experience, and as you can see the emoji wheel as well, which is also connected to the different thoughts that we're thinking, which we express with emojis. Um, a quote from Saint Paisius. This is what he writes about thoughts. Again, it says he writes a person's spiritual state, and I would just say a person's state, to be honest. A person's spiritual state is indicated by the quality of his thoughts, right? The type of spiritual state, meaning our relationship with God, our neighbor, and ourself. This is all related to our spiritual state, right? What happens in our heart, that is what a spiritual state is, right? So the thoughts we have impacts our relationships, right? Those we're in relationship in our life, and St. Paisius writes that to us. All right, so just to look at thoughts, so it's important for us to understand thoughts so that when we have these intrusive thoughts, it could be thoughts that lead us to sin, lead us away from loving our neighbor, being able to be present, to be attentive, to be supportive to our neighbor. It's important for us to see, where do these thoughts come from? What do they do? Trying to understand kind of the science behind the thoughts. And this is what the fathers of the church did. This is what, if you look at the scriptures, right? If you look at the Psalms, if you look at the different writers of the different the Gospels, the scriptures, we see this understanding of thoughts that is there, because we need to understand it a little bit so that we can be able to identify where is this coming from, and be able to fight against certain thoughts that we have. So thoughts, right? These intrusive thoughts. One thing it could do, it can separate us from Christ, our neighbor, and ourself, like I mentioned. It appears in the scriptures, both in a positive and negative sense. We see good thoughts and negative thoughts in the scriptures. So they're thoughts that they tempt us or they distract us in our daily lives, um, and in our path towards holiness. It's a type of thought. Sometimes it's associated with an image, right? So it could be you're fasting right now, and in your mind, you could kind of imagine what a Chick-fil-A sandwich looks like, right? So the thought is, oh, maybe I should have Chick-fil-A, or maybe I should have this sandwich, right, that I really like. And then you kind of imagine what that looks like in your mind, right? So sometimes these thoughts are connected to certain images that entice us, right, to go after whatever that thought is saying in our life. Or we can understand it also as inner voices or suggestions, or in the context of this talk, temptations, right? So it's certain inner voices or temptations, suggestions that, if accepted, can lead us to the devil having power over us, right? And leads us to a loss of our freedom or inner peace. That's what these thoughts often do in our life, and it comes up in different ways throughout our life. Um, what do? They distract us from being present. Maybe we're having a conversation with someone, and we certain intrusive thoughts come to our mind that maybe even about that person who's sharing certain things with us, and we're distracted. And in that moment, we're not really giving them our attention. We're not really loving them. We're not really able to be present to them to offer them support because like our mind is going off on maybe judging that person, maybe having certain thoughts about what they're saying. So it distracts us. It impacts how we feel, how we think, how we speak, um, how we act. It impacts our relationships, certain thoughts that we accept about be a spouse, it'd be a friend, a coworker, your professor in college, your teacher, whoever it is. When we accept certain thoughts about them, it could be judgmental thoughts. It impacts our relationship, right? Or it could even be a thought like, "Oh, I can't trust this person," right? And that's going to prevent us from sharing certain things with that person. And it impacts our relationship, right? Um, it can lead to physical and spiritual illnesses, right? Certain thoughts that we have. Again, if we think that no one loves us and no one, and that we're not good enough, perhaps it'll cause sadness, right? It'll cause us to feel lonely, and that impacts our not only spiritual life, but our physical life, right, as well, our physical health, because these two are connected, right? Spiritual illness is connected to physical illness in certain cases. So we see that even our thoughts, the type of thoughts we harbor in our life, can impact our physical health as well. It causes a loss of peace. It can impact our sleep. Sometimes certain thoughts that we have, we're not able to sleep. So it impacts various aspects of our life. So we may be asking, where do these thoughts come from? Like, where are they from? Um, they're from different sources. They arise from the passions, right? So how we understand passions, it could be anger, gluttony, pride, right? Lust, different things that we struggle with in our life. Sometimes the thoughts come from those passions that we struggle with. Um, and sometimes certain thoughts lead us to the passions. So to certain passions of like I mentioned, right? So certain thoughts can lead us to developing certain passions like lust, anger, right? Gluttony, so on and so forth, pride, right? All these different passions. So sometimes they come from the passions, sometimes they lead us to the passions. So two main sources for intrusive thoughts. Um, One is from the enemy, from the demons. They suggest certain thoughts as a temptation, as a suggestion to us. And the second place is the passions, as we see, meaning from our inner life, things that we struggle with in our life. Those thoughts can often come from that, um, which is from the passions that we struggle with. Also, some thoughts come from God. However, these thoughts, they're not considered a type of intrusive thought, like a negative thought. It's not a negative thought that comes from God, but rather a divine thought. And it's a result of experiencing God and working on that relationship, right? Certain thoughts come from God, from the Holy Spirit, which are good thoughts. It's not an intrusive thought. But these are kind of the sources where we see thoughts in general, intrusive thoughts as well as good thoughts coming from in our life. Connected to thoughts that come from within, from our own struggles. I would also add on this aspect of needs in our life that we have. We have certain needs in our life, especially when you look at it from a mental health perspective. There are certain needs that we have in our life. This is taken from Stephen Muse. It's a book called When Hearts Become Flame. He talks about four realms of human need, and it's basic physical needs, emotional needs, intellectual needs, and spiritual needs. Basic physical needs, as we know, is food, water, shelter, clothing, air, impressions. Basic physical needs that we have. Sometimes certain thoughts come from these. Um, when whether it be food, water, shelter, whatever it may be. Certain things come from that. Sometimes it's from our emotional needs. When certain emotional needs aren't met, certain thoughts will come up, right? So these are emotional needs, some of them, touch, empathy, confirmation of our humanity and inner world, guidance and support, understanding, affection, friendship and belonging, contributing to community, freedom to identify and express the full range of feelings, trust, enjoyment, play, and safety. So different emotional needs. Sometimes the thoughts will come from this. So for example, if we don't feel supported in our life, if we don't feel that people are empathetic towards us, if we feel that um, we're not able to contribute to community, right? And we're not experiencing understanding in our life by our loved ones, those around us. When this is not happening, what happens is certain thoughts will come and say, "Oh, you should do this to satisfy the feeling of loneliness that you have," right? But in that moment, the loneliness you're having is because perhaps you're not being understood by your spouse, by your friend, by your coworker, by your sibling, whoever it may be. That's what you have to work on in that moment. But then thoughts will come from the demons, um, from our inner life, from our passions, saying that, oh, you should just, um, eat more food. That'll make you feel better. And, sometimes in that moment, it does make us feel better, right? When we eat more food. But then in the long run, it's not doing us good, right? It's becoming a passion, right? Um, it makes us turn to certain temporary ways to satisfy unmet needs, right? Certain intrusive thoughts, I would say. It could be, you might not feel supported by your spouse, perhaps, or you might not feel that your spouse is hearing you out. In that moment, you may get an intrusive thought, right? To feel better, right, in that moment. But that intrusive thought is not necessarily the best thing for you. It might not like accepting that intrusive thought is not necessarily the most healthy thing in that moment. What you have to do in that moment is to try to work on your relationship with your spouse, right, or your friend, or whoever it may be that's not hearing you out, that's not giving you support in your life. That's what has to be done. You have to process that with a spiritual guide, right? Have a conversation with that person who you're having that struggle with, to address that need that's not being met. Um, the intrusive thoughts that come to us is just trying to distract us to not work on satisfying these needs that are important in our life, right? These are important needs in our life, but sometimes those intrusive thoughts, they come to separate us further from our neighbor, to separate us further from ourselves, from God, by making us turn to certain things that make us feel better. So we see intrusive thoughts, it's also connected to our needs that are perhaps unmet in our life. Also, intellectual needs, intellectual challenge, meaning and purpose in our life, being understood, work, awareness of self and others, fresh impressions without distortion by passions and education, right? Different intellectual needs that we have. Even when these are not met in our life, it could cause certain intrusive thoughts in our mind. Perhaps it could be our education, awareness of certain, our knowledge of the faith, it could be, right? And perhaps we could get thoughts saying that, oh, you don't know much about your faith. You're not a good Christian. You're failing as a Christian, um, and there's no hope for you. Intrusive thought, right? That you could potentially accept. Um, but if you work on learning more about the faith, living the faith, right? That intrusive thought is less likely to come up, right? So we see certain needs have to be met so that we can prevent certain intrusive thoughts in our life, and spiritual needs as well. Worship, repentance, and the list goes on and on. I'm not going to name all of them. You can read them on the slides. And when a lot of these are not met, more intrusive thoughts come up in our life, trying to separate us from Christ, from hope, right? Trying to separate us from our loved ones in our life and ourselves. So just to keep in mind where some intrusive thoughts might be coming from certain unmet needs in our life. This is kind of a diagram of a living being, a living person, right? A human person. Um, we see where the thoughts are. If you look at the center circle, right? Between the two. So not the one in the center, right? The one outside of that. Where you see soul, thoughts, emotions, and desires. That's kind of where the thoughts are. It's like in our mind, right? Connected to our soul as well. And we see kind of how this works. The heart, thoughts, emotions, desires, and then we see the body as well. Just to kind of show where the thoughts are, where they come up in our human person. Okay, so something for us to reflect on. Is it a sin to have an intrusive thought in our life? I mentioned like in the beginning of the talk, right? Sometimes we're driving on that bridge and we have that thought, oh, what would it be like if I just turned the wheel and I just went off the bridge? Is it a sin to have that type of thought in our life? And when we understand sin, right, in Orthodox tradition, we understand sin not as like breaking of a rule, like you broke a rule. It's more so we see it as an illness, right? The word sin comes from the word in Greek amartia, right? Missing the mark. So missing the mark of being in communion with God. What's the mark? Being in communion with God and our neighbor. That's the mark in our life, to be in communion with God and to be in communion with God through our neighbor. These two things, right? When we do something that prevents us from achieving that mark, right? Fulfilling that mark of being in communion with God and being in communion with God through our neighbor. Whenever we do something that takes us away from doing that, it's a sin, right? That's how we understand sin. So it's more an illness, an inclination towards a certain behavior that separates us from God and our neighbor. So is it a sin to have an intrusive thought? Just for you to reflect on. When we have these thoughts? Is it a sin? So to answer the question, it depends. It depends whether it's a sin or not. It depends on what you do with that thought. So because the thought can be seen as a temptation that comes. So what you do with that temptation will depend whether or not are you missing the mark or are you hitting the mark when it comes to our relationship with God and our neighbor. So the answer is it depends. It depends what you do with that intrusive thought that comes to your mind. If you accept it, if you entertain it, if you start to act on it, both in your mind and in your words and in your actions, if it's an intrusive thought, then it becomes a sin. But if you reject those thoughts, it's not sin. It's not missing the mark because you're given a temptation to miss the mark and you say, no, I will not miss the mark. I will continue on my path towards my relationship with loving God and loving my neighbor. That moment we reject that thought. So it depends what you do with the thought. So don't beat yourself over the head when we have certain thoughts like this, whether it be on the bridge when you're driving, whether it be when you see someone, a certain thought may come to our mind. So what we do with this specific thought is essential. So consent or acceptance will separate us from God and our neighbor. Okay, so we may be asking ourselves, how do we battle the thoughts? How do we battle these thoughts that come to our mind, these intrusive thoughts that often come into our minds? So there's a few spiritual interventions that we could do. Of course, the church offers us these three things, as we know, which is prayer, the biblical patristic understanding, which is the scriptures, and the writings of the fathers, and the sacramental life of the church. Of course, the church offers these three things, and we know to engage ourselves in these three things, and we do this more during the fast, right? More intensely, we do this during the time of the fast. So we know of this, these three things that the church offers us, the life of the church. Some other interventions that we have, of course, engage in the life of the church, which I showed here. Another thing is spend time reflecting if our needs are being met. I mentioned those needs earlier, right? Those different needs that we have in our life. Reflecting on, are those needs being met in my life? And trying to work on those needs when it comes emotionally, spiritually, physically, intellectually. In order to prevent some of these intrusive thoughts from, distracting us, taking us away from our purpose, which is the mark, right, that I mentioned, to be in communion with God and to be in communion with God through our neighbor. So some time reflecting if our needs are being met is a good way to kind of identify what we need to work on in our life. I'm keeping watch over our senses. Again, like I'm showing you the living being diagram again. The senses are in the body, right? It's connected to the body. So keeping watch over our senses, especially like our eyes or ears specifically, it helps us to prevent some of those thoughts that come because the body is connected to the soul where the thoughts generate, right? And it's also connected to our heart. So it's important for us to keep watch over our senses. What are we exposing our senses to during the day? during the evening times, right before we go to bed, what are we exposing our senses to? Because I guarantee you, whatever you're exposing your senses to the most during the day, that thought's gonna come to you in the middle of the night. It's gonna come to you in your dreams, right? Because you've exposed your senses to that a lot. So we see how like senses are connected to our thoughts as well, right? If we saw like a scary movie, um, we will have thoughts most likely about that movie, right? Because we saw it through our eyes, we heard it through our ears, um, but that experience stays with us, and then thoughts can generate from that, right? So similarly, in our lives as well, when we expose our senses to certain things in our life. So um, controlling how much we use our phone is a good place to start. Often our notifications, they decide when we look at the phone. So the phone controls us, right? But I would say we should be deciding when we look at our phone. The phone shouldn't be dictating when I look at the phone, right? Because then, I'm giving the power to the phone to dictate my actions. Like I should be the one deciding when I look at the phone. Um, so something I do is like I turn off most of my notifications on my phone. I turn like most of them off, and I decide when to go look at certain things. So if it's Instagram, my notifications are off on Instagram, and I will go check Instagram when I decide to, right? When I choose to, right? I don't let it decide when I look at it, because I'm taking my power, and giving it to the phone and to the notifications system, right? So perhaps deciding when you look at your phone instead of the phone constantly taking up your time, right? Taking away your attention and causing certain thoughts. Unplugging from unwanted sources of information in your life, because that also causes thoughts. Prayer, making time each day to quiet down through personal prayer, a personal prayer rule, I would say. And also prayer of the mind, which is prayer throughout the day, like while you're doing stuff. So it could be washing dishes, it could be driving, it could be studying, it could be when you're in class, whatever it may be. Praying the Jesus prayer in your mind, saying, "Lord, help me, Lord, be with me," throughout the day. So then we make some space between our thoughts and ourself, instead of the thoughts always um, pushing against us, right, and causing us, despair and loneliness and sadness, thoughts that try to lead us away from our relationships. So making time each day to quiet down, to kind of separate ourselves from those thoughts, to separate ourselves from those thoughts that continue to distract us. So perhaps developing a prayer rule in the morning and evening. It doesn't have to be anything super long, right? It could be 10 minutes in the morning, 10 minutes in the evening, quieting down our minds. Taking a walk is helpful. It could be during work, it could be during your day. Reading, spiritual reading, of course, is helpful, but then also just reading. If you like to read certain types of um, books, right? It's okay to read that, right? To be able to engage your mind in something, right? But it depends what you're reading, of course. Again, because your senses are connected to the certain thoughts that come. So I'm reading appropriate things, of course, but sometimes just reading certain things, it could be the news, right? It helps you, but then you have to be careful because then it also causes certain thoughts as well, thoughts of despair, worry, and things like that. But sometimes reading can also be helpful for certain people. Process thoughts with a spiritual guide. Of course, having someone to process certain thoughts you're having, which again, we could see it as temptations, right? Certain temptations that try to distract us from our relationships in our life. And of course, humility. One of the greatest ways to fight against thoughts is to say, I don't know what to do. Lord, help me. I need your help. I don't want to have these type of thoughts about my spouse, about my friend, about my neighbor, about you, right? About you, God. So asking for help, humility, is a great way to fight against these thoughts that come to our mind. That's when we give space for the Holy Spirit to work in us, to strengthen us with these thoughts. So a few interventions for us to keep in mind. Personal prayer I mentioned, creating space and time for us in the morning and evenings, to make space between ourselves and our thoughts. It's also a way for us to kind of deal with some of those emotions in our life, those difficult experiences in our life that cause certain thoughts, that cause us to have certain thoughts of despair and losing hope. So prayer is a way for us to engage and to ask God for His help. So just something to keep in mind when it comes to dealing with our thoughts. Icons, we see an icon of Christ, right? in certain moments with certain thoughts that come to our mind, looking at an icon. Sometimes even when we pray with our eyes closed, sometimes a certain thought comes to our mind and it's connected to an image, right? It could be an image of someone, it could be an image of food, it could be whatever it may be. It could be from a previous difficult experience, some type of trauma maybe we experienced in our life. Those things come to us, right? Because they're part of our experience, they're part of what we've been through, right? Um, and then they come to our minds. I mean, we shouldn't beat ourselves over the head when intrusive thoughts come, right? Because it depends what we do with the thought. And we are not our thoughts. That's something also I want to emphasize. We are not our thoughts. Sometimes they're just suggestions, just temptations, but it depends what we do with them. So sometimes looking at an icon is helpful, even during prayer, right? Sometimes with our eyes closed, sometimes the thoughts come, images come connected to the thought. Looking at an eye, opening our eyes instead, keeping our eyes closed, and looking at an icon can help us, right? Icon of Christ, icon of the saints, helps us to refocus, right? Helps us to seek the help of Christ and the saints as well. Here's a small book of personal prayer you could use to develop a prayer rule in the morning and evening. Again, like I said, it doesn't have to be something super long. So you could scan this QR code and you can get a PDF of this personal prayer book, which will help in the process of creating more space between us and our thoughts, so that our thoughts are not so overwhelming, are not, taking over our lives and separating us from those in our life and making us feel a certain way with certain emotions. So you could scan this. It's a small little personal prayer book that you could use. A quote from Saint Silouan regarding thoughts: "If a desolate thought comes into your mind, drive it off at once, and you will preserve your peace of soul. But if you harbor it, your soul will lose her love for God, and you will no longer have confidence to pray." Driving off those thoughts in our life is important, so that we can continue to direct our attention towards the Lord. A thought from St. John Cassian, Philokalia. Um, the surest way to guard against the delusion of such thoughts is to seek the counsel of one's spiritual father. So having a spiritual guide to process our thoughts is also an important step in our spiritual journey towards addressing certain thoughts that come to our mind. Because sometimes I would also add certain thoughts that appear to be good, that sound good, might not necessarily be good behind that, right? Sometimes the thoughts present itself as something good. Like it could be like, oh, I want to serve the church, or I want to become this leader or that leader in the church. Sounds like a good thought, right? You're helping the church, right? You're stepping forward to offer your time, but um, it's not necessarily always a good thought, because that might be coming from a place of pride. You might want to have a place of prominence so that people say great things about you, so that people praise you. Um, so is that thought still good? It's not, right? Because it could be coming from a place of pride, right? A place from, it could be a self-seeking thought that, oh, I want to serve the church, but it's because I want everyone to say nice things about me. I want everyone to like me, and I want everyone to praise me, which releases a certain chemical in our brain. If that's the reason why that thought is coming, that's not good. But then certain people have that thought and it's coming from a place of genuine service. So even certain thoughts that appear to be good, it's important to seek counsel whether or not that's a good thought, and that it's coming from a good place, because it depends on our intention. Um, Saint Paisius also writes this, something for us to hold on to in the midst of the different thoughts that come to our mind. He used to liken thoughts to airplanes flying high overhead in the air. If you don't pay them any attention, they simply fly away. However, he added, we must be careful not to build an airport within our heart so that they land. So again, it depends what we do with the thought. Don't beat yourself over the head when you have certain thoughts. It depends what you do with it. If you allow it to land, if you harbor it, if you act on it, meaning if you accept it, then it's becoming a sin, right? It's separating us from God and our neighbor. But if it flies and if you don't allow it to grow in your heart, if you reject it, it allows us to maintain our peace, right? So that certain things don't take us away from God and our neighbor. So just an example for us, so that we can understand thoughts a little better. I want to also show this. This is also from St. Paisius. He writes about having good and negative thoughts in our life. This is what he writes. He writes, some people tell me that they are scandalized because they see many things wrong in the church. You could replace church with anything. Um, I tell them that if you ask a fly, are there any flowers in this area? It will say, I don't know about flowers, but over there in that heap of rubbish, you can find all the filth you want. And it will go on to list all the unclean things it has been to. Now, if you ask a honeybee, have you seen any unclean things in this area? It will reply, unclean things? No, I have not seen any. The place here is full of the most fragrant flowers. And it will go on to name all the flowers of the garden or the meadow. You see, the fly only knows where the unclean things are, while the honeybee knows where the beautiful iris or hyacinth is. As I've come to understand, some people resemble the honeybee and some resemble the fly. Those who resemble the fly seek to find evil in every circumstance and are preoccupied with it. They see no good anywhere. But those who resemble the honeybee only see the good in everything they see. The stupid person thinks stupidly and takes everything in the wrong way, whereas the person who has good thoughts, no matter what he sees, no matter what you tell him, maintains a positive and good thought. So it's also this idea of trying to be like the honeybee, even when moments are negative, right? Moments are not looking too good, right? Maybe someone's bad behavior is being highlighted, right? But in that moment, trying to be like the honeybee is also a way for us to move towards more positive thoughts in our life, more divine thoughts in our life. Just some book recommendations as we close up. Two books, Spiritual Struggle by St. Paisius and Our Thoughts Determine Our Lives. I have both of them here. They're awesome books. They're both available on Amazon. Simple books. It gives us a good understanding of thoughts if you want to understand thoughts further, if you want to learn more about it. Two awesome resources that I highly recommend that you get if you want to learn about this topic. Like I mentioned, you can keep going on and on about this topic. There's so much we could discuss, but this is just an overview of intrusive thoughts in our life. So I recommend these two books when it comes to learning about intrusive thoughts and how to cultivate good thoughts in our life. Also, here's a resource, Intrusive Thoughts According to St. Silouan the Athonite. You can scan this QR code if you want to learn more about thoughts and what the fathers say about sort of intrusive thoughts and how to find healing when it comes to those thoughts. So another resource you could scan with your phone. Just some text resources that were used for this talk, just for your reference. All right, so as we close up, I just want to end with this prayer. It's from the Shahimo from the Thursday Vespers, and talks about our thoughts and how important our thoughts are, and our tradition, our hymnography. It has this understanding of being careful with our thoughts and having pure thoughts, and we even pray about our thoughts in the bedtime prayers as well. This is also in our hymnography when it comes to our thoughts, because like Elder Thaddeus said, our thoughts determine our life, right? So our thoughts are important because a lot of the things in our life, a lot of the decisions we make, a lot of the sins that we fall into, a lot of the illness when it comes to spiritual illness, it begins with our thoughts. So if we can begin rejecting certain thoughts right when they come, it can prevent a lot of illness and a lot of struggle in our life. And we must also see that thoughts are allowed by the Lord, right? He allows us to have those temptations. And you may ask, why? Why does he allow that? Doesn't God love us? Why does God allow certain thoughts and temptations to come my way? Um, it's actually because he loves us. We may think that, oh, does he love us if he allows that? But it's actually because he loves us that he allows that to happen, because he's allowing an opportunity for us to have true freedom in our life, because love is true freedom. For someone to love us truly, it's to give us true freedom. And the Lord gives us that. He gives us true freedom to either choose him or not to choose him in our life, to choose our neighbor or not to choose our neighbor, right? There's this ultimate freedom that's given to us, and that's true love. And God gives us that freedom to choose when it comes to our intrusive thoughts that we have in our life. Because he truly loves us, he wants us to make that effort to choose him if we really want him, if we really want to love him. He gives us that opportunity to choose our neighbor over certain thoughts, if we truly want to love that person, right? So it's about freedom, giving us true freedom, and that's true love, which the Lord gives us. So I close with this prayer from the Shehimo. Vadakamor, O God, who is pure and who loves the pure, grant purity of heart to us at all times. Remove from us all vain concerns and thoughts and cares that are not pleasing to you, O Lord.